We're going to start off with Mitchell to kick off the discussion and chat with us about the communication side of things, what it means to speak to those beyond the climate bubble, as we call it, and how do we speak to those folks from within our communities who might be outside the movement, and build wider public demand for the political will we need from our governments on climate solutions. So Mitchell, passing it over to you for the next few minutes.
Thanks very much, Lauren, and everybody welcome and thanks for being here. The thinking behind this segment of the webinar and behind a fair bit of the work that we've been doing around here over the last couple of years goes back to a moment in October in 2018 in Incheon, South Korea, when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its 1.5 degrees Celsius Pathways report. The release included a news conference for global media, and one of the IPCC scientists, Jim Skia from the UK, said much more elegantly and with a lot more nuance than I'm about to paraphrase him, that basically in the pathway to 1.5, we know what we need to do to get there. We know the solutions. Broadly speaking, they are practical, affordable, ready for prime time. The last box to check, he said, is political will. Now, take yourself back to October 2018. This scene has shifted a little bit since. But in October 2018, there were two things that we knew about political will, or that we thought we knew. One was that as the climate community, as the climate movement, that's what we're about. Along with everything else we're about building political will for faster, deeper carbon cuts. And secondly, we knew from recent experience that so many of the politicians, of those who had taken this at our word and followed through and shown that political will, would go into the next election only to find out that no good deed goes unforgiven. And as examples, I can give you the most recent elections in Ontario and Alberta. I can give you Australia, which is now in the third term of a vicious climate denial government, driven largely, brought to power largely by an albeit manufactured reaction to a carbon tax. That means that demanding political will is what we need to do and what we need to keep doing, and we do very well. But it only works if we can mobilize wide enough public demand to sustain it. And we can only do that by, as Lauren said, working outside the bubbles where we do usually find common ground and common cause with other communities and with other movements. None of what I'm saying excuses our governments from taking vastly more decisive action on vastly faster and deeper carbon cuts, but it does create a mandate for all of us to reach out even farther and wider than we already do, than we already have to date. CAN-Rac has worked hard and worked really well, in my view, to build a far wider constituency for climate action and for a just green transition. And I have to think most, if not everybody on this call has been a part of that. When you attend a UN climate conference, one of the things you find out is that Canada is considered to have the most diverse and intersectional climate community of any of the nodes that make up Climate Action Network International. And an important point, and again, I hope one that wouldn't need to be emphasized to anybody on this call, is that that's not to say that any of us ever get to check the box, in Jim Skia's language, on intersectionality. That's not something, or diversity. That's not something any of us gets to do in a lifetime. But apparently, on the scale of things, we're showing up pretty well. That's urgent, important, right, as far as it goes. But if you think of this in concentric circles, where sort of the core circle is those of us who wake up every morning or most mornings, knowing in our minds what's the next thing we need to do, or the next few things, or 15 million things we need to do today on the climate crisis. The communities we have been reaching out to, working with, learning from, have been maybe the next couple of circles. And what I'm referring to here is the next circles beyond that. Not as a contrast to the community building that we've been doing, and certainly not as a replacement for it, but as another necessary step that we're all going to have to take and spend a lot of time with, I believe, in order to get where we need to go on the political will behind that, public demand behind that political will. So who are these audiences? I have no data for this. One of my favorite things is the plural of anecdote is not evidence, and climate deniers, I'm looking at you. So take this as anecdote, please. I would love to see us collect some data or talk to anybody who already has. But generally, these are people who broadly in their lives want to do the right thing. They don't identify with progressive movements or necessarily with social movements of any kind. They're busy living their lives, and climate change, surprise, surprise, is not the priority they wake up with every morning. That was true enough before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, they aren't just busy in their lives, they're scrambling and scared, or at least scrambling, usually scared. They know climate change is out there. They may have a dim sense that they should do their bit to reduce their own personal or household carbon footprints, because like us, like everybody, they've had that message drilled into them over the last 30 years. We recently learned, courtesy of Grist magazine, that that was the result of a BP greenwashing campaign from the early 1990s. Of course, divorcing that from the structural change that's also needed. They barely have time for that personal commitment. They won't be attending meetings or rallies. They may have difficulty separating fact from spin when things get political. They think of us as political even when we're not being. And yet, and this is the crucial point, they're numerous enough and widespread enough that we won't get this done without their support, or at least without the support of many more of the people who fall into the various audience personas that I've just described. So just a couple of examples, and there are so many others. If somebody pre-pandemic spent 2 hours commuting to and from work each way each day, for a total of, what would that be, 20 hours on the road each week. I can't imagine what it would take for them to think that their tailpipe emissions and reducing them could be more important than knowing that 1 or 2 days every week, first of all, they don't have to get up at 5 in the morning, and secondly, they actually get home in time for their daughter's soccer practice. In the only moment in the known history of their universe when their daughter will ever be 8 years old. Somebody in a rural community, and I do have a particular town in mind when I use this example, but I haven't checked the details with them, so I'm not going to name them. But a rural community where the only major employer in town, the food processing plant, shut down 5 years ago, with the result that by now, nobody under 30 plans to stay because there are no job prospects, and nobody over 30 thinks that's a good idea. By what logic, just by what politeness, would we descend on that community to talk about the climate crisis when we know, and they know, and they know that we know that depopulation is going to get them before the drought does, and that in fact, when their life does intersect with a climate impact, they can't even know for sure what that impact's going to be because they don't know where they'll be. They just know they'll be an internal migrant because their towns die. So how much more effective would it be to start out with questions rather than answers about the climate solutions that'll make a difference on what matters most to them, which is to save the town where their family may have been for 5 or 6 generations or just arrived. Either way, that town is their sense of place, is their life. So how do we connect? I've had a chance to do some informal message testing over the last couple of years, and I've been astonished that this whole line of conversation lands so well. I honestly did not see that coming. But what I keep hearing back from people is that starting out with these kinds of questions translates into the first time people actually saw themselves in the picture, felt they were being listened to, and counters what I think is a wrong stereotype, but still a stereotype that has built up around our community, around our movement, that we're all about lecturing and not listening. So it begins, again, with starting out from what matters to them, with listening to people's priorities rather than lecturing about ours, or at least before lecturing about ours. It starts with the promise that together we'll try to figure out how faster action on climate gets them the things that they already know they need and want faster and better. And along the way, we end up flipping something that our community's been saying about co-benefits for at least a couple of decades that I can remember. And that is, sure, yeah, we get how painful it is every time you have to take your daughter or son to the emergency ward with yet another asthma attack because you live in a fence line community. But you know what? Sign up for this climate campaign, and the co-benefit is that your daughter will be able to breathe. How cool is that? What if we're the co-benefit? What if the thing we're trying to achieve, urgent and important as it is, in most people's lives, is the co-benefit? And what if we can build wider, deeper support for what we know we need to achieve by starting out from that perspective, and then rather than starting out from our own? I think we do this when we're at our best. I'm not certain that we do it as frequently or as consciously as we need to. And I guess the only other thing I would say, because I don't want to take too much time, is that I want to ask you to hear everything I've just said as a conversation opener, not a conversation stopper. it's still message testing. But I really think this is something we need to talk about more and get a better handle on sooner rather than later, in time to win, and in time to win in some of those regions and constituencies where so far, a lot of the time we tend not to. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Mitchell. Yeah, really good thoughts about figuring out how to better communicate with those that we tend to overlook, or we sometimes outright ignore because the conversations can get tricky or feel uncomfortable for us. So some really good reminders there. And I actually think it cues us up really perfectly for our next presenter, Montana. A reminder to those who are tuning in, if you have any questions for Mitchell, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. We'll hopefully be able to draw on them later, but he might just be able to answer them right in those in the chat or the Q&A functions for you. But next to Montana, we're going to turn the floor over to you so we can sort of further dig into those questions of the efficacy of communications. West Kootenay Eco Society has been developing your Neighbors United campaign over the past year to deeply engage with rural and small town residents and help them resolve their conflicted feelings around climate change through deep canvassing. Really excited to hear from you about the work and how your solutions-based storytelling is sort of building that pathway to zero for rural communities in your region. So over to you, Montana. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Can you see my screen okay? All right. So I'm calling in from my home, which is on the unceded and stolen traditional territory of the Sinixt people, also known as Cristova. And yeah, perfect segue. Thanks, Mitchell. You said all the things. I think one of the big problems in the climate movement is we're focused on pushing the progressives while neglecting the small c conservatives. And like Mitchell said, those are the people that are busy. They're just trying to get by, make a buck, care about their families, care about all the things we care about, but are just living their lives day to day, as I wish I could. And I'm sure we all wish we could do more of that as well. And I just want to start by saying, I don't think populism is a dirty word. I know it gets a bad rap, but populism basically means to make something popular. So I think we do need to invest in priorities that move small c conservatives to achieve a populist movement. So equitable climate action policy and supporting projects are an issue that people across the political spectrum support, and it's not so like lefty. So how do we get there? And in the words of Janet Jackson, we go deep. So we've been working on a strategy called deep canvassing in the climate and energy context. And a brief background on deep canvassing. It was developed in the United States following up in 2008 when Obama, of course, won the presidency. And in California, one of the most progressive states, again, same-sex marriage was not allowed, and they lost on that. So to the credit of those amazing organizers in that community, they went out and said, what are we doing wrong? And they went and talked to the people who disagreed with them and listened and asked, what their opinions were and what their ideas were. And from that work of going out and listening and being curious and not being afraid to knock on the doors of people that don't agree with you on an issue, this method of deep canvassing was developed. So it's been used successfully to connect with folks and help them resolve their cognitive dissonance and their conflict on an issue in campaigns like same-sex marriage, transgender rights, immigration, racial injustice, and most recently in getting people to think about voting for Biden over Trump. The really cool thing about deep canvassing is it's been studied in various experiments by Brockman and Kalla out of Stanford, and it shows that it holds over time and can withstand counter arguments. So what this looks like is basically you go to someone's door or call them on the phone, which is what we've been doing now in COVID world, and you have a vulnerable, non-judgmental, candid two-way conversation. It doesn't work if you show up with preconceived notions. You really have to show up authentically and be curious and ask your curious questions and listen and not be trying to push data and facts on folks. And this, in the structure, you come in that way and you're trying to share emotionally vulnerable stories and have the other person share emotionally vulnerable stories so you can find your common ground and see what you can agree on and go from there together. So again, as I mentioned, it has been studied, and the outcome is if you're showing up authentically and doing it, at least 1 in 4 people will shift their views. And this shift lasts at least 9 months out. That's as long as it's been studied. But there's reason to believe it lasts much longer. Another really cool thing it does is if you show up and you're like, I'm an environmentalist, by the end of the conversation, you're not put in this box that the person maybe thought you were in the box as an environmentalist and what they think that is. And likewise, however they identify, it's kind of busting open your stereotypes of the type of person that you think they are. So it's a really amazing tactic and way to connect with people in a community on the issues and common ground that you share. So we launched our project Neighbors United, which is the name of our Deep Canvas project. You can check it out, neighborswithayou.united.org. And we're really proud that we're the first Deep Canvas project in Canada and the first one going on climate. And we've been working on it for over a year. So it's been a pretty intense process. I wanted to share a little bit about the foundation of the Deep Canvas, which is the script. So developing the right script, there's kind of a methodology and structure to how the script works and how it's been developed in other campaigns. But because it hasn't been already done successfully in climate and energy, we've been working on that for the last year. And I'm noticing now that I have accidentally done some weird animation things. So I'm going to click to get them all on there. Great. So we've had I think over 30 versions of our script so far, and I wanted to just share briefly like the different beliefs we were testing. So we started by testing out the idea that we thought maybe people who are deeply connected to the fossil fuel industry don't believe that the renewable energy transition is possible, and so we were using emotional and vulnerable exclusion stories, so being left out of something, to share that. And then we did something similar, testing if people their love for someone or their faith in something could also help them resolve their conflict. And both of those stories, we found that people were just getting really overwhelmed by the problem. So yeah, there isn't like a lot of climate denialism that we're finding in small and rural communities, but we're finding that people are like, we know it's a thing, it's so overwhelming, there's so many solutions, none of them seem to be the right thing, or I think like this one solution could do it, but there's no way that can happen. So it's just too much and I can't think about it. And I can't do anything to make it better. So we've tried to get more specific in what we're doing. So we've tested a pollution story. We're trying to get people to connect with the problem of pollution and waste, dirty air, water, food, and trying to move them out of that feeling of hopelessness and overwhelm to urgency and problem solving. And that was pretty successful. And where we're at now is we're playing with a transportation story, really trying to ground what the problem is in, like Mitchell was talking about, those co-benefits, in something that matters to them, about how they get around. And we're finding that when people can connect with, when thinking about their neighbors and how something might be hard for them, that they're able to resolve some of that conflict and get emotional and think about how things could be better beyond just them. So moving them out of that me into my community. But we're not done, we're still working on it. We've also paired the messages and language and stories we're hearing on the doorstep that are connecting with people and moving people into a solutions-based journalism project. So earlier last year, we launched our publication Living Here, livinghere.ca, and we're doing storytelling, really focusing on people and the solutions that they're a part of. And we're really trying to make sure we're finding people that are relatable to that audience that I like to call the mushy middle, the folks that care and want to do something potentially, but they're just busy and overwhelmed by the whole problem. So does it work? It seems slow, you might be asking yourself. I'd like to point to Georgia as an example of how it does work. So there's a lot of text on these slides. You can read them later. But the point is, in Georgia, as we've all learned, Stacey Abrams and her crew took a long 10-year strategy to achieve the results they wanted to achieve in the Democratic Party and the progressive movement. And that investment in that long-term strategy is what worked. And deep canvassing played a huge role in that, with various groups collaborating on focusing on Georgia as well as other states to have those conversations with people, to help move them and resolve their conflict. And just to say, AOC, which I know so many people in our movement just think is the greatest. So she has endorsed deep canvassing as a thing that works. So yeah, what more proof do you need beyond Georgia if you don't want to go read all the studies? So I wanted to just leave you with a quick summary of what I think are the foundations we need to reinvest in and refocus on to build a climate populist movement. I think we need to first make sure we're listening and getting beyond our bubble, like Mitchell said, to make sure we're not just talking to each other. And maybe that means we don't even know who to talk to. So maybe that means you have to go knock on someone's door or pick up someone and cold call them. But I think we need to listen, ask questions, be genuinely curious, and really understand why people don't agree with you and what's at stake for them, and really let go of being right. We also need to deep canvass. I am so in deep belief that deep canvass is the structured methodology of how we do this in a way that works. So I think we need to expand this in other places. And I'm really happy that we've been able to take on the effort of developing a script that works. So I'm hoping we can share it with others in the movement and help people figure out how to do that. And then we need to focus that on rural, suburban, and small town residents that are being left out of the conversation right now. Then we need to make sure our communications are reflecting what we're hearing. And again, we need to let go of being right. We can say as much as we want, the language and green this, green that, but if people aren't hearing it, it's just further polarizing us. So yeah, we need to make sure that in our communications, we're reinforcing and amplifying the language and messages that we know are connecting with people. And maybe that means letting go of saying things like, wonky climate policy language. And then finally, we need to remember that government relations is important, but if we're not doing the on the ground work to build that climate populist movement, to then create that political will, we can't just have those one-on-one conversations with political leaders and have that be building the political will unless we have that movement to back us, to translate what we're hearing on the ground. So I think for a long time, we've done a lot of investing in government relations without doing that kind of traditional on the ground community organizing to audiences beyond our bubble. And so I think that's a really key missing piece that we need to work on to avoid the pendulum politics and bring up the other side of the political spectrum to having climate action be a standardized thing that you have to care about and be progressive on, or you don't get elected. And I guess by progressive, I mean that just becomes the norm. So thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to hearing what the other folks have to say.
Thank you so much for that, Montana. It's so, I don't know, I love the concept of deep canvassing. It was something I only started hearing about a couple of years ago, but I love that it is so, it's the antithesis of this sort of cynical view that a lot of us in sort of the engosphere have of canvassing, and that it's just sort of this list building exercise. So to take something that people have sort of icky feelings about and turn it into this actual like meaningful vessel for change making is really exciting to see. And the fact that you've done so much of the heavy lifting in terms of like parsing on what those best practices are and developing these scripts is really cool. So I'm sure people would love to see those scripts and those resources that you've put together to try to implement this in their own practices as well. So thanks so much for taking time to tell us about it today. We're going to pivot now. I'm going to pass the reins over to Dean, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about people making changes in their own communities. So Dean, you're here today to talk to us about the National Climate League and how you get citizens involved in your data-driven exercise in participatory democracy, which sounds really exciting. So how has the NCL, the National Climate League, been able to help citizens engage with their local elected officials and really push them towards implementing those sustainable policies at the municipal level? Yeah, excited to hear about the work you do. So I'll pass it over.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And again, I think for Montana's presentation, it's a perfect transition going into how we can engage with people on the ground, how we could get people motivated and back them up with the proper resources to actually now be able to go and talk to their local elected officials, because we need to build that momentum and then actually have that action take place. So super great transition again. I think it flows perfectly. So yeah, as Lauren mentioned, my name is Dean. I am currently based in Montreal, or in traditional Anishinaabeg and Haudenosaunee territory. And I'm the National Campaign Manager of the Climate Reality Project Canada. And I'm also the lead commissioner for our major project called the National Climate League. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Climate Reality Project Canada, our larger sort of like ethos as an organization, our Community Climate Hub initiative, which is specifically the initiative that really drives the National Climate League forward. And we're going to learn like how those people get involved and how they help us gather data to push this net zero forward in Canadian municipalities. So I'm going to share my screen. My slide deck's a little bit just, pretty straightforward, but just so that we all have some sort of visuals and so there'll be some info later on how you could get involved and where you could go to find that information. So as I mentioned, I'm the National Campaign Manager here at the Climate Reality Project Canada. So I essentially help develop campaigns that are both internal and external to the organization throughout the province and country and municipality. So we operate on all orders of government, essentially. So the Climate Reality Project Canada, for those of you not aware of the work that we do, we're a charity organization that we seek to educate people on the causes for and solutions to the climate crisis. Our Canadian branch specifically houses approximately 1,400 volunteers, and worldwide we have over 31,000 volunteers. So internationally, we have branches in the United States, China, India, Brazil, Philippines, Mexico, and other various countries in Africa and Europe. So our Climate Reality Project volunteers, or as we call them, leaders, are recruited via trainings that we hold usually 3 to 4 times a year. This year has been a little bit different. We've been holding them virtually, obviously, because usually we get to meet up in some sort of hub city and get to do massive in-person trainings. And it's really a great moment for people to be able to communicate with each other and meet in person and learn about what's going on in their community on the ground. But obviously, just the nature of this year, things are a bit different. So at these trainings, we have former United States of America Vice President Al Gore, who educates our volunteers on the science and impacts of climate change. He was the one who founded this organization. So I'll go now more into our Community Climate Hub initiative and what they get up to, and then dive into the NCL specifically. So the Community Climate Hub initiative is guided by our premise of think global, act local. And a Community Climate Hub, or CCH, is a group of citizens, businesses, and organizations who are representative of their community and are committed to accelerate progress towards net zero in their community. So we believe that demonstrating that reducing emissions in our communities not only helps the environment that we all share, but it can also improve our quality of life. And I think that's one of the main sort of sentiments of the National Climate League later on that I'll get to, but it's really about improving quality of life, and that's how we like to frame it. Because sort of like you mentioned, those often like high level policy wonk language that Montana touched on could be alienating. And so we like to mention it. It's literally about making your life better in your community and for everyone around you. So the hubs are able to help their municipality take action in 4 key ways. So 1, by rallying diverse voices around a common vision and timeline for their community's decarbonization. 2, advancing policy through education, mobilization, and government relations. 3, encouraging public participation in the development and implementation of plans. And 4, being able to collaborate with other hubs across the country to draw attention to the need for all orders of government to work together. So this CCH initiative is a very decentralized model. We actually have 14 fabulous regional organizers, and I think I see some regional organizers in attendance in today's webinar, so hello all, that help serve our hubs and their teams navigate the trove of resources available on and below the surface of our website. So, and one such way that we help community climate hubs push decarbonization forward is through our National Climate League initiative, which I am the lead commissioner on. So, as we see, Community Climate Hub and our National Climate League, which was just published this last week. So we've released the National Climate League, or as we call it, the NCL, for the last 2 years. And this year it's in its official 3rd iteration that was just released a few days ago. And at its core, we want the NCL to be an exercise in participative democracy. So it's essentially a massive data collection process powered and spearheaded by our hubs. And when published, the NCL highlights local solutions that improve the lives of everyday Canadians. So again, bringing in that improving your everyday quality of life forward. And it also indirectly sets Canadian municipalities, on the path to carbon neutrality by 2050. So how does this all work? So we here at the Climate Reality Project Canada have developed 15 key primary indicators and 15 complementary indicators that are representative of living a better life in your cities. We cover a very broad range of topics. So our indicators range from things such as affordable housing. So again, you might hear that and might not think immediately like, oh, that is directly related to climate, but it's within that sort of sphere of better quality of life. And it is indirectly related to climate because when we have affordable housing, that means we could create, create new opportunities for greener buildings, creating more affordable cities. That way people can be connected and stuff like that. So they're all like indirectly related. We do have some that are a little bit more obviously related to the climate crisis, such as air quality, landfill waste, and things like that. But we wanted to be that better quality of life aspect and also make it very intersectional and understand that the climate crisis encompasses so many different issues, and it's not such specifically those green issues that we think about. So yeah, to quantify these positive impacts, and with our hashtag measure what matters, which you can see on the screen there, we choose these indicators based on 5 different criteria. So accessibility, comparability across cities, the ability of municipal governments to act, their impact on GHG emissions, and whether or not the average citizen actually cares about this particular indicator improving. So what makes this a citizen-led project? So when we launch our data collection season of the standings, it's usually around June or July of every year. We ask everyday citizens to get in contact with their municipalities, asking them to provide data to them on those 15 key indicators and 15 complementary indicators that we've developed. So on our end, we sort of provide templates, we provide guidance on how people can get in contact with their local elected officials, how they could write a letter to their local elected officials and stuff like that, and how on asking for the data that we're looking for. Now, some data is actually quite easy to find. So some data you could even go find online from like reports and things like that. So like, for example, the public transit indicator, we look at the number of trips per capita per 100,000 people. And this information is usually quite public. It's usually easily found in transit reports and things like that, usually from major cities. But when it comes to, maybe smaller cities, some of that data might be a bit harder to find. So that's why we encourage people to get involved and get to know who their elected officials are, and highlight that that's a priority for you in your city living. You want to know what's happening in all these indicators. You want to know if your city has a really good public transit system. You want to know if you have good landfill waste management, things like that. So yeah, we think the NCL overall has 2 main goals. So 1, instill a sense of agency and community through citizen engagement. And 2, to draw on diverse constituencies to demand transparent accountability from their municipality. So yeah, as I've sort of mentioned, this year's standings have officially been released now, and we're super excited to be able to share them with everyone on this call and everyone within the CAN-Rac web network. You can access them by going online. So we have a standing page that I'll put up very soon. But this is just a teaser, sort of like what the first page would look like of the NCL. And you can sort of see a broad overview of certain cities that have performed really, really well in certain indicators versus some cities that might have not. Yeah, this is just a broad overview. So as you can see, we collected about 325 new data points this year from across 45 different municipalities. And we also have a huge database of all this data that is publicly accessible. So not every single data point is represented in the NCL itself, but we have the online Airtable database that anyone can go access and take a look at what data is available. And we do believe that being data literate is really, really important in getting your elected officials convinced to moving something forward. To have that data to back up why something is important to you, can go a really, really long way. So yeah, you could access the standing at this site, and we have a landing page with all the resources that are available to you and how you could now use these standings. We have templates, we have 2-pagers, we have toolkits that you could use to look at it and be like, hey, oh, it looks like, for example, Winnipeg didn't do so well in this indicator. Maybe I could go, and if you're from Winnipeg, you could be like, hey, I want to do better in that indicator in my city. I could use these resources to now contact my elected official and be like, oh, look at this data that the Climate Reality Project has put together for us. And we want to make sure this is a priority for the city of Winnipeg moving forward. We've also developed a podcast, which we're not sure right now exactly how often this will be released, but we had it with our launch. We're collaborating with McGill University on it. We wanted to center the discussion around having an academic with someone on the ground. So it's a conversation about electric vehicles in cities and the pros and cons for that and how we can push those initiatives more forward. So yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll leave our page up, and we're super excited. And we hope that you use the NCL to get involved in your community. And if you want to contribute to next year's NCL, that's an opportunity as well. We're always open to new people coming in and being like, hey, I'm really interested in the data collection aspect. I really want to get involved in this and understand what that's like. Feel free to reach out to me. I could put my email in the chat and we could get connected.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Dean. And actually, because we're making good time, so I think we might actually have room for some Q&A at the end. So reminder for our participants to drop questions in the chat and the Q&A function. We're going to move right along to Judy to sort of keep us going on the municipal, not politics, municipal solution side of things. So yeah, Judy, you're here to chat with us about the Climate Caucus and your experience with it. It gives you an understanding of how place-based action can effectively be taken in municipalities all across diverse regions. I'm eager to hear about the recently released Councillor Handbook you published and what municipally led and oriented climate action really looks like in towns and cities across so-called Canada. So to you, Judy.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I'll just share my screen here first. Okay, first I thank you for the invitation to present here, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the traditional and unceded territories of the Sinixt, Salix, and Ktunaxa peoples in interior BC, where I'm very grateful to live. We did present earlier in the series, so I'm just going to give a very quick intro, and it's interesting hearing the previous speakers that looked at the support coming from the community, and that is so critical to what we're doing, so I'll try and tie those two together. We're on the other side with locally elected officials. So we have mayors, councillors, regional directors, reeves, a few school trustees from all across Canada. And we're guided by our vision statement, 110-0, One Planet, which means we are very aware of the ecological and planetary boundaries, 10 years, that we need to move very quickly and no one left behind. So we're trying to place an equity lens on all of the place-based actions that we work with. Here's a picture from Federation of Canadian Municipalities in, in June 2019. Climate Caucus had just formed a few months before with a few councillors started in Nelson. They reached out to their colleagues across the country to see who might be interested, managed at the last minute to get a room at the FCM conference and wondered if anyone would come. And as you see, councillors really care. There was standing room only, and it was a great launch to the organization, which is just a little over 2 years old now. So just passing the 2-year mark, we're here at 320 plus elected officials representing 100 communities. And although we're focused our audience on elected officials, we know we can't do it without the communities. So what I'm going to show you today has a dual audience for both of those two groups. What my particular focus today is on our Councillor Handbook, and it's an ongoing project. We hope to actually have a more official launch with make it look good and so on. Right now, it's a series of Google Docs that are accessible to anyone, and you'll be able to access this from our website anytime. And what we're trying to do is collect and share place-based best practices for municipal climate action. So it's quite easy to gather together general ideas, things like, oh, you should have a green roof policy, and don't forget to declare an emergency and think about buildings. But that doesn't actually help our councillors implement. It's easy to say those things, but then you need to implement. So what we've been working on for the last, couple of years is gathering quite detailed plans and case studies, because it's quite apparent that local government is inherently conservative. They seldom want to be the last one to do anything, but they really, really don't want to be first. So they want to say, okay, this was successful somewhere else. So that's really critical to getting this action happening in your communities, to show it's been successful in another similar sized place. We're also pulling into the handbook resolutions, bylaws, and including briefing notes, some that we develop ourselves, so that when a councillor brings this forward, for example, a green roof policy, they can be ready for the pushback that inevitably comes. Typically, it's how much will this cost? Has anyone done it before? If it's a buildings policy, what about renters? What about developers? So that they're ready to answer those questions. So we're pulling all this into the handbook. And what I'm going to take just a few minutes to do is give you a little walking tour through the 5 main chapters of this. So you have a taste of what's in there, and then you'll be able to go have a look for yourselves. So our first chapter is zero waste and circular economy. This is a repair cafe rather in Vancouver. And this chapter is quite extensive. It has a lot of initiatives that you could have a look at and bring to your communities. For example, the regional district of Nanaimo was one of the first to adopt zero waste as a goal, as an organics ban for their landfill education initiatives. So policies like that are fully fleshed out in there with links, things like the Toronto's circular economy plan. And then a new area that we're working on is gathering information on deconstruction policy. Vancouver is starting on this so that instead of, when a building is torn down, instead of demolishing it, we're actually collecting all the parts of the building and reusing those somewhere else. Second chapter that's quite fully built out at this point is our buildings chapter. It's a passive house showing here. So we've got bylaws in there about how to incentivize passive homes, passive buildings. A lot of the work at local government happens by negotiation with developers before it even gets to council. So councillors need to have an awareness of how to incentivize developers to bring in more passive housing, more energy efficient buildings. Got a large section on retrofit policies in there from all over Ontario, Edmonton, Halifax. There's also a detailed section on how to support the installation of heat pumps. Some great work was done in the Yukon. We have other sections on plans for accessory dwelling units, laneway housing, ways to increase density. So that's our building section. Food security isn't as fully built out. This is a little smaller, but you will see bylaws in there and materials for food policy councils, community gardens, bylaws to encourage the promotion of backyard bees. So I know I've been at our council meeting where they're saying, yeah, this is great, but how do we actually do that? And it's so much simpler if you can say, well, here it was done in these communities. Here's a bylaw to promote bees. Here's all the information, all the research they already did. You don't need to do it again. And I was able to use it myself, being on the advisory planning commission in my town, when someone asked about trees and say, well, yeah, we could have a tree bylaw. Here's what was done in Oakville. It would work here. Nature-based solutions, we have a grad student working on this right now, so it's going to be quite extensive. She's got a lot of work done. Green roof, such as shown here, we have quite a detailed section on green roof policies. Again, how to incentivize developers to include that. We've also got urban tree canopy programs. We're connecting with Nature Canada on their work. Natural rainwater systems from Vancouver to Ottawa. We now have a new Indigenous section as well here. The final chapter that we have in place right now is transportation. So here's something from my hometown, the e-bike program, which a way for residents to get their own e-bikes or retrofit an existing bike to that. We've also did a lot of work on parking policies. We may not sound very exciting, but parking policies, if done right, are a way to get cars off the road. And Edmonton is a leader in North America in this, so we're sharing their work. We've also got some complete street programs from Ontario, cycling policies from Saskatoon, and several others. So we're going to keep building this out, and we are going to add a section on rural and small communities, pulling out all the initiatives that suit those communities. And where we're going with this, put a little call for action here, because again, the councillors can't do it without the community support our other presenters are speaking about. And we are working on a partnership with Climate Hubs, who was just speaking, and that'll be great, and other advocacy groups as well. So when our councillors bring these forward, they have some community support, but alternatively, anyone there working as a climate advocate is totally welcome to go into the handbook, pull out examples and bring them to your counselors and say, hey, why aren't you doing this in our community? So we hope you'll do that, to share the counselor handbook, and also invite your counselors to join us. We find being part of Climate Caucus and having that moral support with other climate friendly counselors is extremely helpful. And if you look in there and you don't see initiatives from your community that you're very proud of, please send them to us, because we'd love to include all of them. So there's my email, judy@climatecaucus.ca, if you want more information or you want to share your initiatives, and I can put that in the chat as well. And I'll be around here if you have questions, but I'm really excited to share this with you and hope you'll have a good look and give us some feedback and some more ideas. Thank you.
That was so fantastic. Thank you so much, Judy. So we do have about 9 to 8 minutes left. So I have a question that I'm going to pose to Montana and Mitchell, and then one that I'm going to pose to yourself, Judy, and Dean, if that's okay. So Montana and Mitchell, both of you really drove home the importance of the necessity to relationship build with those beyond the bubble. At the same time, I've often heard this refrain in progressive circles where education isn't my job, or that it's inefficient to speak to those that we can't convert, that it's inefficient to spend that effort on those conversations. I think my question is, when is this true, if it's ever true, or is there always sort of value in trying? Or in your experience, are there some sort of situations where maybe, yeah, that's my question. Is it always true? Is it ever true? Or is it always worth trying to speak to somebody from sort of beyond our bubble?
I'll take a first stab, Mitchell, if that's okay.
I know now I'm good, but go ahead. Sorry.
I think it's always worth doing. I mean, what have we been doing for the last 30 years? We've been talking to each other. So look where that's gotten us. Greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise in Canada, across the world. The wealth gap is bigger than ever. So I'd say what we've been doing hasn't been working. We can take some of the things, the pieces that have been like showing promise and haven't been like bad, and use them. But overall, I think we need a new strategy for our movement. And I think it's to talk with, after listening to, the people that don't agree with us.
I was going to say much the same thing. Thanks, Lauren. Inefficiency and education is inefficient. I think where the idea that it's inefficient comes from is that we're all of us doing this work because we're seized with how urgent this is, with how quickly we need to get the job done. But it's inefficient to talk to people and to try to reach out beyond the bubble. I guess my answer to that would be, how's it working for us so far, right? When at this point, the best Canada can come up with at a time when the European Green Deal is calling for 55% by 2030, the best we can come up with is a federal government that, yes, gets past its 30% target that it inherited from Stephen Harper by celebrating that we're going to be incrementally past 31% by 2030. Hey, I'm happy, are you? Obviously, we need something that'll move that farther faster. And it may feel inefficient, but what's so and I heard this so powerfully in Montana's presentation, that going a little bit slower means we can go a lot faster. And that is so counterintuitive when we're all up against the 2030 and 2050 deadlines and all the deadlines in between. But it's not working so far, as Montana said, not working well enough, and we have to get farther. Education isn't our job. I guess my immediate reaction to that is, and again, Montana, I was just thrilled with your presentation that I'm going to make reference to it twice. What I see in methodology like deep canvassing is that, you know what, we're not educating, we're learning. We're not lecturing, we're listening. We're discovering where people are starting from. And once we have that, it's not a lecture, it's not an education session, it's a conversation and just a mutual exploration, which I'd like to think is what most of us would want to do in our lives anyway.
I'd love to add one more quick point. I think, if you look at investment in things like advertising campaigns and government relations, it's like big bucks going in there. And we just, again, what is the results, especially with advertising campaigns? You don't know what's happening with those dollars. So I think, yeah, investing in one-on-one conversations seems expensive, but you can scale it using really good engagement organizing practices that work. So I think it's just like rethinking about investment in the movement and trying something different.
Well, thank you both so much for your insight. I think again, you've made a really compelling case for us taking the time to, like you said, Montana and Mitchell, focus on the learning that we can do as opposed to just the preaching that we can do. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. To Judy and Dean, the question I think I have for you is, when you're looking at these municipalities where, like Dean, in your case, like you're measuring the successes, and Judy, you're part of making those successes happen. What are the commonalities between municipalities where solid progress has been made? I know, like, having lived in cities or municipalities where progress hasn't been happening as quickly, it can be really frustrating. So what are the best practices? I know there isn't, but is there a magic ingredient? Is there some sort of, is there something in the water in these places where progress has seemingly happened so much faster than in other cities?
Oh, that's a great question. I can take a stab at it. I think it's a combination of things. I think from the council side, it's having some really strong champions, but champions that learn how to be very strategic and sometimes don't even explicitly take that champion role. They work with their colleagues and they work really hard to get buy-in and consensus. And then on the other side, having a community that really cares. So it's tougher in the resource towns, definitely. But anywhere, if people really care, you'll see that action. For example, you wouldn't think Edmonton is a place that you might expect a lot of climate success, but they have been amazing. So something's going on there. And it makes a huge difference to do that. And I'll just add that one of the things councillors keep telling us, and they're sharing their experiences with one another, which is really valuable, is, and this was referred to in some earlier presentations, is I think especially Mitchell was saying that we shouldn't be the main thing. Maybe we should be the co-benefit. And they say definitely to get success in climate action, you don't lead with climate. You lead typically with the finances, the economics, and you say, oh, and by the way, this will help GHG. So those kind of strategies make a big difference. If you're upfront, again, lecturing your community, they won't listen. But if you say, this will help you, one example I heard recently was in a resource community in BC, where they wanted to stop the pollution in a lake, and this was coming from all their septic systems. They couldn't present this as a pollution issue. They presented it as, this is going to give you more usable land in your yard because you won't have to have a septic field. And this is actually going to save you money. So taking that kind of approach in these communities, that strategic approach, is where they've had great success.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I do think definitely there's like, when people feel like they belong somewhere, like they're in a community, I think change happens. So when you signal that you care about where you live and you organize and you're able to bring that to city council, to whatever it might be, I think that's when change happens. But I do also take your point of you saying there is obviously no silver bullet solution to something like this. And especially in the Canadian context where our governance structures get quite messy, like from having our structure of federalism where, we have the Constitution that separates certain divisions of powers. And that's why I think it's so important to have this municipal lens, because often municipalities are overlooked because we're always like, oh, like messy environment stuff, is that the province's issue? Is that the federal government's issue? So I think by tackling this from a lens of like, okay, I really want to make sure my city is clean, like out of my immediate surroundings. And if I could network with people who care about that too, I think that change is easier implemented than we think, because we sort of avoid the messier politics of maybe higher orders of government. As a policy person myself who's worked in policy, I know how that could get and all the fights that happens there. But I really think the city is a place to make change. But I also am cognizant of political situations are different, geographic situations are different. So even though in the NCL itself, we have that sort of like lessons learned aspect to it, where we're like, hey, this city did really well. These are the policies they have in place that really fostered this indicator to thrive. It is important to also be like, okay, like sometimes a city in Alberta might be different than a city in Ontario. So I think navigating those waters is also important, understanding really the political context on a broader scale. helps. Yeah, I think that'd be my answer.
No, well said, everybody. Well, we are right at the top of the hour. So thank you all so much for sticking with us for the full 60 minutes. Huge round of applause for our fantastic speakers. I learned so much today. It was inspiring. It was educational. Thank you all so much. One last reminder that the series is continuing for the next few weeks. So next week, Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time is our Cutting Edge Solutions webinar, where we'll have speakers from the Canadian Institute of Climate Choices, Transition Accelerator, and a few others joining us. So if you haven't already, head on over to climateactionnetwork.ca to register for that. And with that, I will leave you all for the afternoon. Thanks again so much for your time, folks. Have a great day.